First time I attempted to pray through the Psalms systematically, it was rough. Someone had told me the Psalms are God's prayer book, the prayer book for God's people. Jesus prayed these prayers. This is Jesus' prayer book. If you want to be like Jesus, you need to pray the Psalms. And I was like, great, sign me up. How do I do it? And they're like, well, the easiest way is you do the one per day thing. So day 1, Psalm 1, day 2, Psalm 2, so on and so forth. And when you get to the end, just start over again. There's 150. That'll keep you busy for a while. I was like, awesome, let's try this. And that worked amazing for about 2 days. But then day three, I found myself praying, and I quote, "Strike all my enemies on the jaw, break their teeth." I'm pretty sure until that moment in my life, I had never prayed for God to break someone's teeth. And then it just went downhill from there. Day 10, I was praying break their arm. Day 11, I was praying burn down raining sulfur on them. And it descends from there. I mean, Psalm 58, the righteous will be glad when they are avenged and they bathe their feet in the blood of the wicked. Psalm 69 and Psalm 109 are especially vitriolic. They are a stream of curses in a prayer book. They're prayer curses. So Psalm 69, a psalm of David. May their eyes be darkened so they cannot see. May their backs be bent forever. Pour out your wrath on them. Charge them with crime upon crime. Do not let them share in your salvation. May they be blotted out of the book of life and not be listed with the righteous. I'm like, did I just pray that someone would go to hell? Can I pray that? Psalm 109 might be the best, by which I mean the worst. Appoint an evil man to oppose him. Let an accuser, in Hebrew, accuser is you know the word, Satan. Let Satan stand at his right hand. When he's tried, let him be found guilty. May his prayers condemn him. May his days be few. May his children be fatherless. May his children be wandering beggars. May creditors seize all that he has. When he shows up at the DMV, may he not have the right paperwork. No! It goes on like this for 20 verses. Like, how can I pray this? It crescendos at verse 14. May the iniquities of his fathers be remembered before the Lord. May the sin of his mother never be blotted out. Curse the guy's mom. So it's one thing to read these or like study them as like some ancient curiosity. It's another thing to pray them. So what's this doing in a prayer book of God's people? And how did it get there? And what are we supposed to do with it? Are we supposed to like skip over it? Are we supposed to be embarrassed by it or pretend like it's not there? Or are we supposed to pray it? And if so, what does that mean? How do we do that? So I'm not going to pretend like all of this makes perfect sense to me. Or like I'm comfortable praying all of this. I'm still not. I find myself wincing at these words often. But I have experienced enough life in this fallen world that I know sometimes those prayers actually start to make sense. So 10 years ago, went to Cambodia, visiting some missionaries there. And while I was there, got to spend some time in one of the villages where they had planted a house church and got to know one of the church leaders, this sweet, sweet lady, single, impoverished widow, literally trusting the Lord for her daily bread. Amazing woman of faith. And after a few days of being there, I got to hear her story and found that, she's been a widow a long time, but only recently lost her son. You see, her son one day was walking their cows. So Cambodia village, the way you keep your wealth is in cattle. They were walking their cows from the pasture back home to the stall. And it just so happened that a rich young man who lived in the village, son of a wealthy man, was riding his scooter. And in that village, to have a scooter was a sign of great wealth. So he's important riding his scooter. I know, funny, different world. But he's riding his scooter, and just then the cows were crossing the road, so he had to slow down his scooter for that. This is a Buddhist shame honor culture. And so in that culture, for him to force him to slow down on his scooter when he wanted to drive through, well, he took that as a slight, as dishonoring him. His honor was challenged by that, so he proceeded to pull out a knife and stab the boy to death. He murdered him. And then nothing. Police looked the other way, son of a wealthy man. He's still like riding around on a scooter in town, happy as could be. Tell me, how do you think this woman should pray? More personally, when I was a teenager, I won't go into the details, but I was a teen and I learned this discovery that one of my family members had been abused by another family member. And as a teenager, I didn't know what to do with this, and I felt such seething hatred, rage, anger, grief, and I just didn't know what to do with it. I guess I wanted God to break their teeth, break their arm, damn them to hell. But I didn't have words for it, and I certainly didn't feel like I had permission to say those things or pray those things, so I did what we did in my family. It was you bury it, you don't talk about it. And so I pretended like I didn't feel it, pretended like things were okay, and then I prayed really nice prayers to God because that's what I thought He wanted to hear. Or more recently, I've seen women terrorized by their husbands, terrorized and abused. I've seen husbands and wives do unthinkable evil to their family. I've seen men and women entrapped and betrayed in their business, and I've seen things done to children that are unspeakable. I've seen evil. So tell me, how do you think someone should pray when they experience that? How would you pray? So I'm not going to pretend like I can explain any of these Psalms, but here's what I can say, pretty certainly. According to the Psalms, the way forward with God is not to hide, suppress, deny, manage, or control these feelings and experiences, but to pray them, to be brutally honest with God and with ourselves in prayer. So down through the ages, through church history, Athanasius, John Calvin especially, they refer to the Psalms as an anatomy of the soul. Like it opens you up. You can see everything in the human soul in the Psalms. So the Psalms, they open us up, to quote Hebrews, dividing soul and spirit, joints and marrow, judging the thoughts and attitudes of the heart. So when we pray the Psalms, we can see what's hidden in the human heart. We can see what's hidden in our hearts. And at times, it's terrifying. One psalm in particular stands apart in this way, and it's Psalm 137. That's going to be our text for today. It's page 504 in your Pew Bible if you want to follow along. Psalm 137. It is raw and brutally honest and exposing. It's a psalm that shows us what it looks like to talk to God in everything, in every circumstance, in every situation, and in every season, in everything, even in our hatred. So this psalm, Psalm 137, like much of the Old Testament, some of the New Testament, was written from a very, very dark place, a very, very dark time in the history of God's people. So, context here, January 588 BC, the Babylonian army lays siege to the city of Jerusalem. Now, the city of Jerusalem at the time was fortified. So, 2009, they discovered that underneath the current city walls, they discovered the foundations of what used to be the city walls of ancient Jerusalem, and the individual blocks to build that wall were 4 to 5 tons each. Enormous stones. So this is a well-fortified city, like huge fortifications. So, ancient Near Eastern Warfare 101, the Babylonians come in to lay siege, but they're blocked by the army. They're blocked, but the Israelites are trapped now inside. So it's a waiting game. They're trapped inside, and they begin slowly to starve to death. They call to their neighbors for help, but nobody's going to help them. Nobody's going to stand against the Babylonian army. And then finally, 2.5 years later, the Babylonians break through. They pour into the city. They indiscriminately slaughter men, women, children. We have some of the ancient annals of the Babylonians, British Museum, and the records describe them bragging about how they would slice open pregnant women, kill children. It's horrific. 2 Kings chapter 25 describes the scene. It says Zedekiah, the king of the Jews, had escaped, tried to escape. He ran away when all this happened, but then they chased him down, caught him, slaughtered all of his sons in front of his eyes, and then plucked out his eyes, so that would be the last thing he ever sees. Then they put bronze shackles on him, drug him back to Babylon as a trophy. The army then proceeds to pillage all of Jerusalem. They go in and famously break down, like melt off all the gold, break down all the instruments of the temple, and then this is the last time you will ever see the Ark of the Covenant, for example. And then they knock down the city walls, set fire to the city, and the survivors, the handful of survivors who are left, guys like Daniel, you may have heard of him, are marched back on a trail of tears 1,000 miles back to Babylon. And all the while that this is happening, the Edomites, their next door neighbors, but not just neighbors, family members. The Edomites were descended from Esau, who was his brother was Jacob. So Edomites come from Esau. Jacob becomes Israel, the father of the Jews. So the Edomites were siblings, were cousins. The whole time that this is going on, the Edomites supported the Babylonians in this. So they're betrayed by their own family in the midst of this tragedy. Those who do survive and make it into exile, they get put into a reprogramming effort by the Babylonians. The Babylonians are trying to intentionally erase their identity. So you might remember, guys like Daniel, he receives a new name so that his Hebrew name, his Hebrew identity is erased. He's now Belshazzar, which is named after a Babylonian god. So this is not just replanting them into a new place. This is trying to erase their identity, erase the people of God. Their very existence is in doubt. And God himself, where's he at? Like his temple's been destroyed, everything's been stolen. Like what does it mean to be Jewish when there is no temple, there is no priest, there is no sacrifice, there's no king, there's no city of God? It appears that God's promises to Abraham, Isaac, Jacob, David have failed. So tell me, how do you pray when you just experienced that? So Psalm 137, this is how you pray. By the rivers of Babylon we sat and wept when we remembered Zion. The word for Zion here is a reference to Jerusalem, but it's not just a geographic reference. Zion, when they refer to Jerusalem as Zion, they're referring to Mount Zion, which is the place where God's holy presence dwells, the place where God fulfills all of his promises, the place of justice, the place where heaven and earth meet, the place that is home. They sat and they wept as they remembered that. There, on the poplars, we hung our harps. There, our captors asked for songs, us for songs. Our tormentors demanded songs of joy. They said, "Sing us one of the songs of Zion." So these are presumably musicians who used to perform at the temple, lead God's people in worship. But now they're transplanted into Babylon, and the Babylonians are mocking them, asking them to sing those songs. Sing us one of those God songs about God's promises. I want to hear one of those. In Hebrew, the word there is emphasized. So one of the commentators, a Hebrew scholar, James May, he calls this verbal finger pointing. I think this is good. Where he's like, there, in Babylon, there. They asked us to do it there. That's the emphasis. So this kind of mockery was common enough in the ancient Near East. In the British Museum, there's one whole ancient Assyrian palace room that is reconfigured in the museum. And if you go along one of the large walls is the Battle of Lachish. And so the Assyrians came in, and Lachish was an Israelite city that was conquered by the Assyrians. And in it, you see all these scenes of the Assyrians doing their horrific torture to the people and ultimately taking the Israelite king and having him bow at the feet of the Assyrian king and things like that. And you also see on that wall this. If you look closely, it is an Assyrian soldier forcing Israelites to sing their songs of Zion for him in mockery. It's a thing. This is one of the ways you show your dominance over them. right? So this is not just soldiers mocking Jewish culture. This is mocking who they are, mocking everything they believe, mocking the promises of God. And if you know your history, you know that this is not just ancient history. The Nazis did the same thing. So we have stories from Treblinka, a Nazi extermination camp. This is an eyewitness account. And here's the scene. Thankfully, this picture is blurred, so you can hardly see what it is. But you can imagine. It reads like this. On one occasion, having shot a group of sickly prisoners in a nearby forest, some of the guards ordered those selected as gravediggers to grab a body and dance around the pit they had dug while singing in Yiddish. They were all made to throw the bodies into the pit in unison when a signal was given. Such perverted scenes of torture were part of daily life at the camp. That's what's happening here. How can we sing the songs of the Lord while in a foreign land? How can we sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land? So I didn't quite appreciate the connection between the land and faith of Israelites, how important the land was to Jewish people, until I went to Israel with a bunch of rabbis. For the Jews, the promise cannot be separated from the place. They are a people of the soil, of the earth. They literally describe themselves this way. This is the place where God had swore to Abraham. This is where God's holy name resides. This is where God chose to place his temple. This is where the kingdom of God was to be established now and forevermore. So how can we sing the songs of the Lord in a foreign land? The answer is, we can't. We can't. According to Torah, worship is to take place in Israel and Jerusalem. So do you hear this? This is not just a song of grief. This is a crisis of faith. But I want you to note, as we move forward in this, curiously enough, instead of destroying their faith, the persecution seems to strengthen their resolve. Like the more the tormentors mock, the tighter they cling to the promises of God. Look at verse 5. If I forget you, O Jerusalem, may my right hand forget its skill. May I not be able to play the harp or lyre anymore. May my tongue cling to the roof of my mouth. May I not be able to sing. If I do not remember you, if I do not consider Jerusalem my highest joy. This is a curse. It's the kind of curse you'd mutter in an oath. Like, if I forget Jerusalem, if I forget what's happened, if I forget who I am and who God is, may I never be able to play this instrument again. May I never be able to sing again. That's what's going on here. And I want you to notice, in this text, the act of remembering becomes an act of resistance. It's a statement of never forget. Never forget this. That in some backwards way, the psalmist is reminding the people of God of who they are and what their relationship with God means to them by recalling what the tormentors were demanding of them. So, step out of this for a minute. Just hear this. Sometimes you need someone to demand that you give up your faith before you realize that your faith is worth clinging to. Sometimes you need someone to demand that you give up your faith before you realize it's worth clinging to. So there was a famous experiment, 1950s. Here's an actual photograph from it. It's Stanley Milgram. He was a Yale professor, and it's his famous shock experiment. So he invites two people in, and you're sitting in this waiting room, and he says, okay, here's what's going to happen. One of you will be the teacher, and one of you will be the student. And randomly we're going to select, and then you just happen to become the teacher, okay? So you sit in this room, and you're going to ask the student who's going to be in the next room over, strapped into these electrodiode things, you're going to ask them questions. And anytime they get a question right, you're going to be like, that's right. And anytime they get them wrong, you're going to press this button that's going to send an electric shock through them. All right? But here's the deal. Every time they get it wrong, you're going to crank it up one notch. And the question is, does the electrical shock actually help them remember things? Now, what you did not realize, though, was that the student is actually a paid actor who's paid to get every question wrong. And as you crank it up, they're not actually getting shocked, but they're screaming louder and louder and talking about their heart issues and et cetera, et cetera. So the real question he was asking was not, can you teach someone to remember things by electrocuting them? The real question he was asking is, how far will this nice suburbanite go? Would they electrocute the stranger in the next room if a man in a lab coat tells them, and I quote, "The experiment requires you to continue"? Now, it turns out that up to 90% of these nice white suburban people are willing to kill a complete stranger. Kill them, fry them in their chair if someone just tells them the experiment requires it. But the part that often gets skipped, and the part that I actually find more interesting, or at least as interesting, is that the fact that if the man in the white lab coat changed his verbiage, if instead of saying the experiment requires that you continue, if he changes it into a command, it says, you must do this. If he commands them, 100% of those commanded refused. 100%. Not a single person would obey that command. Now, isn't that curious? Isn't that curious? So you and I, we might choose to do something wrong, something immoral. We might go along with immorality, something that doesn't align with our personal values. We might do that. But the moment someone demands that you do it, something snaps in us. No, that's not who I am. I won't do that. I won't be part of that. We remember who we are, and we refuse to be part of it. So I wonder if that's what this psalm is up to. By praying this prayer, the psalmist is inviting us to hear our tormentors demand that we mock our own faith. Now, you and I, we might be willing to mock our own faith. We might be willing to break our own relationship with God. We might be willing to walk away from it every day of the week. But if someone demands it, something snaps in us. And we remember who we are. We remember what's at stake. And we refuse. Isn't that interesting? By reliving this captive, cursed moment, we feel our identity in God and our faith form in a way that we might never experience in perfect freedom and blessing. It requires experiencing the captivity and the curse of that moment to know who we are. Because sometimes you need someone to demand that you give up your faith before you realize it's worth clinging to. Remember, O Lord, what the Edomites did on that day Jerusalem fell. Tear it down, they cried, tear it down to the foundations. If you read the book of Obadiah, you will realize that God did indeed remember what the Edomites did. And then the psalm then ends with two beatitudes. So beatitudes are like what you have in the Sermon on the Mount. Blessed are, happy are. We also saw them at the beginning of the psalm, Psalm 1 and Psalm 2. Psalm 1 says, happy, blessed is the one who does not walk in the way of the wicked. Psalm 2, happy, blessed are those who take refuge in God's King. This is a blessing or a happiness, except it has a slightly different tone. Listen to this. Daughter of Babylon, doomed to destruction. Happy is the one who repays you for what you have done. Happy is the one who seizes your infants and dashes them against the rocks. This is one of the most horrific images in all of the scriptures. It is pure hatred. And that's how the prayer ends. Amen. Now, before we tell the psalmist just how wrong they are and unchristian they are, I want you to just for a minute try and imagine yourself in their shoes. Try and make sense of why this might be in a prayer book. And the first thing I want you to notice is that this image of children having their heads dashed against rocks, this is not some sadistic image that the psalmist made up. The psalmist didn't come up with this image. The Babylonians did. This is a Babylonian creation. So historically, we know that this is exactly what the Babylonians did to the Israelites. So when they were captured in Jerusalem, what they would do is they would go out to the villages, they would find families, and just to terrorize the people trapped in the city, they would take their infants by the feet and dash their heads against the rocks to get the people inside the city to give up. Tell me, how should you pray after that? Now, the right answer, the answer I suspect you already know, is that we know that God works all things for the good of those who love the Lord and have been called according to his purpose, right? That we should bless and not curse, do good to those who persecute you, forgive, turn the other cheek, love your enemies. That's the right answer. And undeniably, when people can step into this, it is beautiful. It's intoxicatingly beautiful. So we've seen this across time. If you know the story of Corrie ten Boom with her Nazi tormentors, it's intoxicating. If you know the story of the Amish school shooting in 2006 where they immediately forgave, it's beautiful. If you know Jesus hanging on the cross where he prays, Father, forgive them, they know not what they do, that is unquestionably better, and this is where our hearts need to be. But how do you get there? And what if at that moment you really do hate? Should we just not talk to God about it? Should we just say, hey, I'm not going to pray anymore until hatred's gone from my heart? Will the Lord be embarrassed or surprised or ashamed of us if we actually tell him how we really feel? And here, this psalm invites us to be brutally honest with God and with ourselves in prayer, to drag it out into the open, and to get this, don't miss this, to lay it in his hands, to trust him with it. And this is the second thing I want you to see in this. This is not personal revenge. He's not asking God, just give me an opportunity to kill one of their babies. He's not praying that. He's praying, God, you do this. God, I need justice. He's calling on God for justice rather than acting on it himself. He's laying it in God's hands. Now, this is almost certainly hatred. Almost certainly hatred is woven into these words, but the psalmist is giving his hatred to God. He's trusting God to handle it. So there's a famous Old Testament scholar, Walter Brueggemann, who you've heard me refer to throughout this series, and he has this summary of this very psalm. It's worth reflecting on. He says it this way. It is an act of profound faith to entrust one's most precious hatreds to God, knowing that they will be taken seriously. It is a profound act of profound faith to entrust one's most precious hatreds to God, knowing that they will be taken seriously. Now, I'm willing to bet that almost every single person in this room can point to some brokenness in your life that then led to a greater wholeness. Do you think God can do the same with our hate? How might praying our hatred, placing it in his hands, actually become a first step in real forgiveness and healing and loving our enemies? So I first met Chris Webb years ago, a couple decades ago, and he stands out. He's an interesting character because he's Welsh, has this crazy accent. I can't even pretend like I can replicate it. And he's a monk, but he's an Anglican Benedictine monk, which my mind was blown. I didn't even know such a thing exists. And he would wear a Franciscan habit, so he looked like a Jedi Knight. Huh? Yeah, it was great. And he told this story. He said one day this young woman came into his office, and she was seething with hatred. Just some young man had done awful things to her. And she said, don't tell me I have to love him. Don't tell me I have to forgive him. I hate him. I hate him. And his response was, wait. Let's get something straight. I can't fix you. I can't fix this. I don't do that. I'm not a counselor or psychologist. You should go to one of them, but I'm not that. I'm a monk. I don't do that. I teach people how to pray. So do you really, really hate him? And she's like, I do. I hate him. He's like, I've got just the prayer for you. It was fantastic. And he taught her Psalm 109, appoint an evil man to oppose him, let Satan stand beside him. May his days be few, his children be fatherless, his children be wandering beggars. Curse his mom. Yeah, this is great. He was excited about it. And he said, pray those words, and you just, all the hate that you have, you just pour it out to God. And come back in a couple weeks. And she's like, I'm going to. So a couple weeks go by, and then she comes into his office, and she looks different, though. She's not quite as riled up anymore. And he's like, well, how'd it go? Did you pray the prayer? Did you pray the prayer? What happened? And she said, well, I intended to. Yes, in fact, I started out that way. I hated him so much that every day I would get there, and I would pray, and I'd just start cursing in the middle of it. For about 3 or 4 days. But she said, by the 5th day, I just wasn't so angry anymore. And by the 2nd week, I just didn't want to. I don't know. I just didn't hate him so much anymore. When she gave her most precious hatred to God, he removed the hate from her heart. I wonder if that's what these Psalms are up to. It's almost like if we can just take all the curses and the hatred and the darkness in our hearts and lay it into his hands, he can do what we can't do. He can handle it. So I'm not going to pretend like I can explain all of this. I can't. I'm not going to pretend like I'm comfortable with all of this. I'm not. But Jesus is. So Luke 19, Jesus is on the Mount of Olives. He's overlooking the city of Jerusalem. And at this point, it had been rebuilt after the Babylonians had destroyed it. And so he's overlooking the temple itself. It's shining in glory. And he's getting ready to go in. He is the promised king, the king that they've been waiting for. He's the king that they've been longing for forever. The promised king is going to ride in, and the people are out there, and they're waving palm fronds, and they're singing songs of Zion. But Jesus knows what they don't know. He knows that he's going to go in, and they're going to reject him, and he's going to be handed over to his enemies and mocked and nailed to the cross. And when they reject God's king, his Messiah, he's going to remove his hand of protection. And in 70 AD, the Romans are going to come in and destroy Jerusalem in a way that is even worse than what the Babylonians did. He sees all of it in that moment. And we read, as he approached Jerusalem and saw the city, he wept over it. The days will come when your enemies will build an embankment against you and encircle you and hem you in on every side. This is going to happen. And they will, Psalm 137, they will dash you to the ground, you and the children within your walls, and they will not leave a stone on another, because you did not recognize the time of God's coming to you. I want you to notice when he then enters into Jerusalem, he doesn't come to dash anyone's babies against the rocks. Instead, he himself is going to be dashed. Like over the next week, all the curses of the Psalms, all the curses of God's people down through the ages, all the hatred that you and I have in our hearts that's been poured out, gets poured out on him. So if you read Psalm 10, Psalm 69, Psalm 22, Psalm 109, the curses, the hatred, Jesus gets it all. Like he's the one who's betrayed. He's abandoned. He's stripped naked. He's left to thirst. He's punished and mocked and tormented. The only son of the Father is murdered. And then on the cross, he becomes a curse that we might become the righteousness of God. Somehow he bore our most precious hatred. It was poured out on him, but it didn't defeat him. 3 days later, he defeats it, and he revealed a life that's beyond the curse, a life that cannot be touched by curse, a life that is truly life, that somehow on the cross, our hatred was overpowered by his love. So if you are carrying around hatred in your heart, if you feel like you cannot pray because your heart is so full of hatred and curses because of what's been done to you, because of what you've seen. I'm sorry. But I also have to say, wait. Let's get something straight. I'm not a counselor. I'm not a psychologist. I can't fix you. I'm a pastor. I teach people how to pray. That's what I do. And I got a few psalms that maybe you should try.